Hello. So today I'm going to be reading to you part one of an essay written by J.R.R. Tolkien called On Fairy Stories. And at first glance, when you just see fairy stories, most people will think, oh, that's childish or that's stupid or what could you possibly get out of that? But I think Tolkien's conception of the fairy story is a lot different from what you might expect. A fairy story to Tolkien is equivalent to a sub-creation, the generation of an imaginary world, which, even though it's imaginary, nonetheless has the same consistency and detail of reality. That it's the type of story that is the creation of something entirely new, not found in the real world, and yet requires not the suspension of disbelief, but instead creates in you the desire to believe because of its consistency and because of its internal rationality, almost. So, the creation of this type of art is one of the greatest achievements that an artist can make. And Tolkien thinks this because it provides us with a certain amount of value. It enriches our lives, and it gives us certain things that cannot be acquired almost anywhere else. And so I'm going to, without any further introduction, begin reading this essay to you. I'm going to break it up into 4 parts because I tried reading it all at once and it turned into about an hour of reading, and that just seemed a little too long, so I'm going to just do it part by part. This is part 1. I propose to speak about fairy stories, though I am aware that this is a rash adventure. Fairy is a perilous land, and in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. And overbold I may be accounted, for though I have been a lover of fairy stories since I learned to read and have at times thought about them, I have not studied them professionally. I have been hardly more than a wandering explorer, or trespasser, in the land, full of wonder but not of information. The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm a man may, perhaps, count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them, and while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates should be shut and the keys be lost. There are, however, some questions that one who is to speak about fairy stories must expect to answer, or attempt to answer, whatever the folk of fairy may think of his impertinence. For instance, what are fairy stories? What is their origin? What is the use of them? I will try to give answers to these questions, or such hints of answers of them as I have gleaned, primarily from the stories themselves, the few of all their multitude that I know. What is a fairy story? In this case, you will turn to the Oxford English Dictionary in vain. It contains no reference to the combination fairy story, and is unhelpful on the subject of fairies generally. In the supplement, fairy tale is recorded since the year 1750, and its leading sense is said to be a tale of fairies, or generally a fairy legend with developed senses, b, an unreal or incredible story, and c, a falsehood. The last two senses would obviously make my topic hopelessly vast, but the first sense is too narrow. Not too narrow for an essay, it is wide enough for many books, but too narrow to cover the actual usage. Especially so if we accept the lexicographer's definition of fairies, quote, supernatural beings of diminutive size, in popular belief supposed to possess magic powers and to have great influence for good or evil over the affairs of men. Supernatural is a dangerous and difficult word in any of its senses, looser or stricter. But to fairies it can hardly be applied, unless super is taken merely as a superlative prefix. For it is man who is, in contrast to fairies, supernatural, and often of diminutive stature, whereas they are natural, far more natural than he. Such is their doom. The road to fairyland is not the road to heaven, nor even to hell, I believe, though some have held that it may lead thither indirectly by the devil's tithe. O see ye not yon narrow road, so thick beset with thorns and briars? That is the path of righteousness, though after it but few inquires. And see ye not yon braid road, that lies across the lily leven? That is the path of wickedness, though some call it the road to heaven. And see ye not yon bonny road, that winds about yon ferny brae? That is the road to fair elf land, where thou and I this nightmare gave. As for diminutive size, I do not deny that the notion is a leading one in modern use. I have thought that it would be interesting to try to find out how that came to be so, but my knowledge is not sufficient for a certain answer. Of old there were indeed some inhabitants of fairy that were small, though hardly diminutive, but smallness was not characteristic of that people as a whole. The diminutive being, elf or fairy, is, I guess, in England largely a sophisticated product of literary fancy. It is perhaps not unnatural that in England, the land where the love of the delicate and fine has often reappeared in art, fancy should, in this matter, turn toward the dainty and diminutive, as in France it went to court and put on powder and diamonds. Yet I suspect that this flower and butterfly minuteness was also a product of rationalization, which transformed the glamour of elfland into mere finesse, and invisibility into a fragility that could hide in a cowslip or shrink behind a blade of grass. It seems to become fashionable soon after the great voyages had begun to make the world seem too narrow to hold both men and elves. I said the sense stories about fairies was too narrow. It is too narrow, even if we reject the diminutive size, for fairy stories are not, in normal English usage, stories about fairies or elves, but stories about fairy, that is, fairy, F-A-E-R-I-E, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, bread and wine, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Stories that are actually concerned primarily with fairies, that is, with creatures that might also in modern English be called elves, are relatively rare, and as a rule not very interesting. Most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm, or upon its shadowy marches. Naturally so, for if elves are true, and really exist independently of our tales about them, then this is also certainly true. Elves are not primarily concerned with us, nor we with them. Our fates are sundered, and our paths seldom meet. Even upon the borders of fairy we encounter them only at some chance crossing of the ways. The definition of a fairy story, what it is or what it should be, does not, then, depend on any definition or historical account of elf or fairy, but upon the nature of fairy, the perilous realm itself, and the air that blows in that country. I will not attempt to define that, nor to describe it directly. It cannot be done. Fairy cannot be caught in a net of words, for it is one of its qualities to be indescribable, though not imperceptible. It has many ingredients, but analysis will not necessarily discover the secret of the whole. Yet I hope that what I have later to say about the other questions will give some glimpses of my own imperfect vision of it. For the moment, I will say only this. A fairy story is one which touches on or uses fairy, whatever its own main purpose may be, satire, adventure, morality, fantasy. Fairy itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic. It is magic of a peculiar mood and power, at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious, scientific magician. There is one proviso. If there is any satire present in the tale, one thing must not be made fun of, the magic itself. That must, in that story, be taken seriously, neither laughed at nor explained away. This concludes the first section of Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. Thank you for watching. This is part 2 of Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. In this section, he addresses the question of the origins of fairy stories, as well as the idea that fairy stories are meant particularly for children. I hope you are following along, and thank you for watching. What are the origins of fairy stories? I am too unlearned to deal with this question in any other way than with a few remarks that will hopefully suffice. It is plain enough that fairy stories, in wider or in narrower sense, are indeed very ancient. Related things appear in very early records, and they are found universally, wherever there is language. We are therefore obviously confronted with a variant of the problem that the archaeologist encounters, or the comparative philologist, with the debate between independent evolution, or rather invention, of the similar, inheritance from a common ancestry, and diffusion at various times from one or more centers. Most debates depend on an attempt by one or both sides at oversimplification, and I do not suppose that this debate is an exception. The history of fairy stories is probably more complex than the physical history of the human race, and as complex as the history of human language. All three things, independent invention, inheritance, and diffusion, have evidently played their part in producing the intricate web of story. It is now beyond all skill but that of the elves to unravel it. Of these three, invention is the most important and fundamental, and so, not surprisingly, also the most mysterious. To an inventor, that is, to a story-maker, the other two must in the end lead back. Diffusion, borrowing in space, whether of an artifact or of a story, only refers the problem of origin elsewhere. At the center of the supposed diffusion, there is a place where once an inventor lived. Similarly with inheritance, borrowing in time, in this way we arrive at last only at an ancestral inventor. While if we believe that sometimes there occurred the independent striking out of similar ideas and themes or devices, we simply multiply the ancestral inventor, but do not, in that way, the more clearly understand his gift. Philology has been dethroned from the high place it once had in this court of inquiry. Max Muller's view of mythology as a, quote, disease of language can be abandoned without regret. Mythology is not a disease at all, though it may, like all human things, become diseased. You might as well say that thinking is a disease of the mind. It would be more near the truth to say that languages, especially modern European languages, are a disease of mythology. But language cannot, all the same, be dismissed. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tale are in our world coeval. The human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, discriminating it from other things, and finding it fair to look upon, but sees that it is green as well as being grass. But how powerful, how stimulating to the very faculty that produced it, was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation in fairy is more potent. And that is not surprising. Such incantations might indeed be said to be only another view of adjectives, a part of speech in a mythical grammar. The mind that thought of light, heavy, gray, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic that would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn gray lead into yellow gold, and the still rock into swift water. If it could do the one, it could do the other. It inevitably did both. When we can take green from grass, blue from heaven, and red from blood, we have already an enchanter's power upon one plane, and the desire to wield that power in the world external to our mind awakens. It does not follow that we shall use that power well upon any plane. We may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. We may make the rare and terrible blue moon to shine. Or we may cause woods to spring with silver leaves and rams to wear fleeces of gold, and put hot fire into the belly of a cold worm. But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made. Fairy begins. Man becomes a sub-creator. An essential power of fairy is thus the power of making immediately effective by the will the visions of fantasy. Not all are beautiful, or even wholesome, not at any rate the fantasies of fallen man. And he has stained the elves who have this power, in verity or in fable, with his own stain. This aspect of mythology, sub-creation, rather than either representation or symbolic interpretation of the beauties and terrors of the world, is, I think, too little considered. I will now turn to children, and so come to the last and most important of the three questions. What, if any, are the values and functions of fairy stories now? It is usually assumed that children are the natural or the specially appropriate audience for fairy stories. In describing a fairy story which they think adults might possibly read for their own entertainment, reviewers frequently indulge in such waggeries as, quote, "This book is for children from ages of 6 to 60. But I have yet never seen the puff of a new motor model that began thus. This toy will amuse infants from 17 to 70, though that, to my mind, would be much more appropriate. Is there any essential connection between children's and fairy stories? Is there any call for comment if an adult reads them for himself? Reads them as tales, that is, not studies them as curios. Adults are allowed to collect and study anything, even old theater programs or paper bags. Among those who still have enough wisdom not to think fairy stories pernicious, the common opinion seems to be that there is a natural connection between the minds of children and fairy stories, of the same order as the connection between children's bodies and milk. I think this is an error, at best an error of false sentiment, and one that is therefore most often made by those who, for whatever private reason, such as childlessness, tend to think of children as a special kind of creature, almost a different race, rather than as normal, if immature, members of a particular family, and of the human family at large. Actually, the association of children and fairy stories is an accident of our domestic history. Fairy stories have, in the modern lettered world, become relegated to the nursery as shabby or old-fashioned furniture is relegated to the playroom, primarily because adults do not want it and do not mind if it is misused. It is not the choice of the children which decides this. Children as a class, except in a common lack of experience they are not one, neither like fairy stories more nor understand them better than adults do, and no more than they like many other things. They are young and growing and normally have keen appetites, so the fairy stories as a rule go down well enough. But in fact, only some children and some adults have a special taste for them. and when they have it, it is not exclusive, nor even necessarily dominant. It is a taste, though, that would not appear, I think, very early in childhood without artificial stimulus. It is certainly one that does not decrease, but increases with age, if it is innate. It is true that in recent times fairy stories have usually been written or adapted for children. But so may music be, or verse, or novels, or history, or scientific manuals. It is a dangerous process even when it is necessary. It is indeed only saved from disaster by the fact that the arts and sciences are not as a whole relegated to the nursery. The nursery and schoolroom are merely given such tastes and glimpses of the adult world as would seem fit for them in adult opinion, often much mistaken. Any one of these things would, if left altogether in the nursery, become gravely impaired. So would a beautiful table, a good picture, or a useful machine, such as a microscope, be defaced or broken if it were left long unregarded in a schoolroom. Fairy stories banished in this way, cut off from a full adult art, would, in the end, be ruined. Indeed, in so far as they have been so banished, they have been ruined. The value of fairy stories is thus not, in my opinion, to be found by considering children in particular. Collections of fairy stories are, in fact, by nature attics and lumber rooms, only by temporary and local custom playrooms. Their contents are disordered and often battered, a jumble of different dates, purposes, and tastes, but among them may occasionally be found a thing of permanent virtue, an old work of art, not too much damaged that only stupidity would have ever stuffed away. I have said, perhaps, more than enough on this point. At least it will be plain that, in my opinion, fairy stories should not be specially associated with children. They are associated with them, naturally, because children are human, and fairy stories are a natural human taste, though not necessarily a universal one. Accidentally, because fairy stories are a large part of the literary lumber that in latter-day Europe has been stuffed away in attics. Unnaturally, because of erroneous sentiment about children, a sentiment that seems to increase with the decline in children. And that concludes part 2 of J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. Thank you for watching. This is part 3 of J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. This section is regarding fantasy. The human mind is capable of forming mental images of things not actually present. The faculty of conceiving the image is or was naturally called imagination. But in recent times, in technical, not normal language, imagination has often been held to be something higher than the mere image-making, ascribed to the operations of fancy, a reduced and depreciatory form of the older word fantasy. An attempt is thus made to restrict, I should say misapply, imagination to, quote, the power of giving to ideal creations the inner consistency of reality. Ridiculous though it may be for one so ill-instructed to have an opinion on this critical matter, I venture to think the verbal distinction philologically inappropriate, and the analysis inaccurate. The mental power of image-making is one thing, or aspect, and it should appropriately be called imagination. The perception of the image, the grasp of its implications, and the control, which are necessary to a successful expression, may vary in vividness and strength, but this is a difference in degree of imagination, not a difference in kind. The achievement of the expression, which gives or seems to give the inner consistency of reality, is indeed another thing, or aspect, needing another name. Art, the operative link between imagination and the final result, subcreation. For my present purpose, I require a word which shall embrace both the subcreative art in itself and a quality of strangeness and wonder in the expression, derived from the image, a quality essential to fairy stories. I propose, therefore, to aggregate to myself the powers of Humpty Dumpty, and to use fantasy for this purpose, in a sense, that is, which combines with its older and higher use as an equivalent of imagination the derived notions of unreality, that is, of unlikeness to the primary world, of freedom from the domination of observed fact, in short, of the fantastic. I am thus not only aware but glad of the etymological and semantic connections of fantasy with fantastic, with images of things that are not only not actually present, but which are indeed not to be found in our primary world at all, or are generally believed not to be found there. But while admitting that, I do not assent to the depreciative tone, that the images are of things not in the primary world, if indeed that is possible, is a virtue, not a vice. Fantasy, in this sense, I think, is not a lower but a higher form of art, indeed the most nearly pure form, and so, when achieved, the most potent. Fantasy, of course, starts with an advantage, arresting strangeness. But that advantage has been turned against it, and has contributed to its disrepute. Many people dislike being arrested. They dislike any meddling with the primary world, or such small glimpses of it as are familiar to them. They therefore stupidly and even maliciously confound fantasy with dreaming, in which there is no art, and with mental disorders, in which there is not even control, with delusion and hallucination. But the error or malice engendered by disquiet and consequent dislike is not the only cause of this confusion. Fantasy has also an essential drawback. It is difficult to achieve. Fantasy may be, as I think, not less but more sub-creative. But at any rate, it is found in practice that the inner consistency of reality is more difficult to produce, the more unlike are the images and the rearrangements of primary material to the actual arrangements of the primary world. It is easier to produce this kind of, quote, reality with more sober material. Fantasy, thus, too often remains undeveloped. It is, and has been used frivolously, or only half seriously, or merely for decoration. It remains merely fanciful. Anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say, "the green sun." Many can then imagine or picture it. But that is not enough, though it may already be a more potent thing than many a thumbnail sketch or transcript of life that receives literary praise. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted, and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art, indeed, narrative art, story-making in its primary and most potent mode. In human art, fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature. In painting, for instance, the visible presentation of the fantastic image is technically too easy. The hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it. Silliness or morbidity are frequent results. It is a misfortune that drama, an art fundamentally distinct from literature, should so commonly be considered together with it, or as a branch of it. Among these misfortunes we may reckon the depreciation of fantasy. For, in part at least, this depreciation is due to the natural desire of critics to cry up the forms of literature or imagination that they themselves, innately or by training, prefer. And criticism in a country that has produced so great a drama, and possesses the works of William Shakespeare, tends to be far too dramatic. But drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. Fantasy, even of the simplest kind, hardly ever succeeds in drama, when that is presented as it should be, visibly and audibly acted. Fantastic forms are not to be counterfeited. Men dressed up as talking animals may achieve buffoonery or mimicry, but they do not achieve fantasy. This is, I think, well illustrated by the failure of the bastard form, pantomime. The nearer it is to dramatized fairy story, the worse it is. It is only tolerable when the plot and its fantasy are reduced to a mere vestigiary framework for farce, and no belief of any kind in any part of the performance is required or expected of anybody. This is, of course, partly due to the fact that the producers of drama have to, or try to, work with mechanism to represent either fantasy or magic. I once saw a so-called children's pantomime, the straight story of Puss in Boots, with even the metamorphosis of the ogre into a mouse. Had this been mechanically successful, it would have either terrified the spectators or else have just been a turn of high-class conjuring. As it was, though done with some ingenuity of lighting, disbelief had not so much to be suspended as hanged, drawn, and quartered. In Macbeth, when it is read, I find the witches tolerable. They have a narrative function and some hint of dark significance, though they are vulgarized poor things of their kind. They are almost intolerable in the play. They would be quite intolerable if I were not fortified by some memory of them as they are in the story that I read. I am told that I should feel differently if I had the mind of the period, with its witch hunts and witch trials. But that is to say, if I regarded the witches as possible, indeed likely, in the primary world. In other words, if they ceased to be fantasy. That argument concedes the point. To be dissolved or to be degraded is the likely fate of fantasy when the dramatist tries to use it. Even such a dramatist as Shakespeare. Macbeth is indeed a work by a playwright who ought, at least on this occasion, to have written a story, if he had the skill or patience for that art. A reason more important, I think, than the inadequacy of stage effects is this. Drama has, of its very nature, already attempted a kind of bogus, or shall I say at least substitute, magic. The visible and audible presentation of imaginary men in a story. That is in itself an attempt to counterfeit the magician's wand. To introduce, with even mechanical success, into this quasi-magical secondary world, a further fantasy or magic, is to demand, as it were, an inner or tertiary world. It is a world too much. To make such a thing may not be impossible. I have never seen it done with success. But at least it cannot be claimed as the proper mode of drama, in which walking and talking people have been found to be the natural instruments of art and illusion. For this precise reason, that the characters and even the scenes are in drama not imagined but actually beheld, drama is, even though it uses a similar material, words, verse, plot, an art fundamentally different from narrative art. Thus, if you prefer drama to literature, as many literary critics plainly do, or form your critical theories primarily from dramatic critics, or even from drama, you are apt to misunderstand pure story-making, and to constrain it to the limitations of stage plays. You are, for instance, likely to prefer characters, even the basest and dullest, to things. Very little about trees as trees can be got into a play. Now, a fairy in drama, those plays which, according to abundant records, the elves have often presented to men, can produce fantasy with a realism and immediacy beyond the compass of any human mechanism. As a result, their usual effect upon a man is to go beyond secondary belief. If you are present at a fairy in drama, you are yourself, or that you think you are, bodily inside its secondary world. The experience may be very similar to dreaming, and has, it would seem sometimes by men, been confounded with it. But in fairy and drama, you are in a dream that some other mind is weaving, and the knowledge of that alarming fact may slip from your grasp. To experience directly a secondary world, the potion is too strong, and you give it to primary belief, however marvelous the events. you are deluded. Whether that is the intention of the elves, always or at any time, is another question. They, at any rate, are not themselves deluded. This is for them a form of art, and distinct from wizardry or magic, properly so called. They do not live in it, though they can, perhaps, afford to spend more time at it than human artists can. The primary world, reality, of elves and men is the same, if differently valued and perceived. We need a word for this elvish craft. But all the words that have been applied to it have been blurred and confused with other things. Magic is ready to hand, and I have used it above, but I should not have done so. Magic should be reserved for the operations of the magician. Art is the human process that produces, by the way, it is not its only or ultimate object, secondary belief. Art is art of the same sort, if more skilled and effortless, the elves can use also, or so the reports seem to show. But the more potent and specially elvish craft I will, for lack of a less debatable word, call enchantment. Enchantment produces a secondary world, into which both designer and spectator can enter, to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside. But, in its purity, it is artistic in desire and purpose. Magic produces, or pretends to produce, an alteration in the primary world. It does not matter by whom it is said to be practiced, fey or mortal, it remains distinct from the other two. It is not an art, but a technique. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills. To the elvish craft, enchantment, fantasy aspires, and when it is successful, of all forms of human art most nearly approaches. At the heart of many man-made stories of elves lies, open or concealed, pure or alloyed, the desire for a living, realized, sub-creative art, which, however much it may outwardly resemble it, is inwardly wholly different from the greed for self-centered power which is the mark of the mere magician. Of this desire the elves, in their better, but still perilous part, are largely made. And it is from them that we may learn what is the central desire and aspiration of human fantasy, even if the elves are, all the more so insofar as they are, only a product of fantasy itself. That creative desire is only cheated by counterfeits, whether the innocent but clumsy devices of the human dramatist, or the malevolent frauds of the magicians. In this world, it is for men unsatisfiable, and so imperishable. Uncorrupted, it does not seek delusion nor bewitchment and domination. It seeks shared enrichment, partners in making and delight, not slaves. To many, fantasy, this sub-creative art which plays strange tricks with the world and all that is in it, combining nouns and redistributing adjectives, has seemed suspect, if not illegitimate. To some, it has seemed at least childish folly, a thing only for persons or for people in their youth. As for its legitimacy, I will say no more than to quote a brief passage from a letter I once wrote to a man who described myth and fairy stories as lies. Though, to do him justice, he was kind enough and confused enough to call fairy story making breathing a lie through silver. "Dear sir," I said, "although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. That right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made." Fantasy is a natural human activity. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason. and it does not either blunt the appetite for, nor obscure the perception of, scientific verity. On the contrary, the keener and the clearer is the reason, the better fantasy will it make. If men were ever in a state in which they did not want to know or could not perceive truth, facts, or evidence, then fantasy would languish until they were cured. If they ever got into that state, it would not seem at all impossible, fantasy would perish and become morbid delusion. For creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, not a slavery to it. So upon logic was founded the nonsense that displays itself in the tales and rhymes of Lewis Carroll. If men really could not distinguish between frogs and men, fairy stories about frog kings would not have arisen. Fantasy can, of course, be carried to excess. It can be ill done. It can be put to evil uses. It may even delude the minds out of which it came. But of what human thing in this fallen world is that not true? Men have conceived not only of elves, but they have imagined gods, and worshipped them, even worshipped those most deformed by their author's own evil. But they have made false gods out of other materials. Their notions, their banners, their monies, even their sciences and their social and economic theories have demanded human sacrifice. Abssus non tollit usum. Fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. This ends part 3 of Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. Thank you for watching. Hello, this is part 4 of Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, the final section of this essay. This part discusses the 3 main virtues of fairy stories according to Tolkien: recovery, escape, and consolation. Recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are, and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need, in any case, to clear our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Of all faces, those of our familiars are the ones most difficult to play fantastic tricks with, and most difficult, really, to see with fresh attention, perceiving their likeness and unlikeness. That they are faces, and yet unique faces. This triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that are trite, or in a bad sense familiar, are the things that we have appropriated, legally or mentally. We say we know them. They have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter, or their color, or their shape, and we laid hands on them, and then locked them in our hoard, acquiring them, and acquiring ceased to look at them. Of course, fairy stories are not the only means of recovery or prophylactic against loss. Humility is enough, and there is, especially for the humble, moroefic or Chestertonian fantasy. Moroefic is a fantastic word, but it could be seen written up in every town in this land. It is coffee room, viewed from the inside through a glass door, as it was seen by Dickens on a dark London day, and it was used by Chesterton to denote the queerness of things that have become trite, when they are seen suddenly from a new angle. That kind of fantasy most people would allow to be wholesome enough, and it can never lack for material. But it has, I think, only a limited power, for the reason that recovery of freshness of vision is its only virtue. The word moroefic may cause you suddenly to realize that England is an utterly alien land, lost either in some remote past age glimpsed by history or in some strange dim future to be reached only by a time machine. To see the amazing oddity and interest of its inhabitants and their customs and feeding habits. But it cannot do more than that. Act as a time telescope focused on one spot. Creative fantasy, because it is mainly trying to do something else, make something new, may open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away like caged birds. The gems all turn into flowers or flames, and you will be warned that all you had or knew was dangerous and potent, not really effectively chained, wild and free, no more yours than they were you. The fantastic elements in verse and prose of other kinds, even when only decorative or occasional, help in this release, but not so thoroughly as a fairy story, a thing built on or about fantasy, of which fantasy is the core. Fantasy is made out of the primary world, but a good craftsman loves his material and has a knowledge and feeling for clay, stone, and wood, which only the art of making can give. By the forging of Germ, cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and moon, root and stock, flower and fruit, are manifested in glory. And actually, fairy stories deal largely, or the better ones mainly, with simple or fundamental things, untouched by fantasy. But these simplicities are made all the more luminous by their setting. For the story-maker who allows himself to be free with nature can be her lover, not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words, and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. I will now conclude by considering escape and consolation, which are naturally closely connected. Though fairy stories are of course by no means the only medium of escape, they are today one of the most obvious and, to some, outrageous forms of escapist literature, and it is thus reasonable to attach to a consideration of them some considerations of this term escape in criticism generally. I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used, a tone for which the uses of the word outside literary criticism give no warrant at all. In what the misusers are fond of calling real life, escape is evidently a rule very practical, and may even be heroic. In real life, it is difficult to blame it, unless it fails. In criticism, it would seem to be the worse the better it succeeds. Evidently, we are faced by a misuse of words, and also by a confusion of thought. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word. And what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Just so, a party spokesman might have labeled departure from the misery of the Führers, or any other Reich, and even criticism of it, as treachery. In the same way, these critics, to make confusion worse, and so to bring into contempt their opponents, stick their label of scorn not only onto desertion, but onto real escape, and what are often its companions: disgust, anger, condemnation, and revolt. Not only do they confound the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter, but they would seem to prefer the acquiescence of the Quisling to the resistance of the patriot. To such thinking, you have only to say, the land you love is doomed, to excuse any treachery, indeed, to glorify it. For a trifling instance, Not to mention, indeed, not to parade, electric street lamps of mass-produced pattern in your tale is escape, in that sense. But it may, almost certainly does, proceed from a considered disgust for so typical a product of the robot age, that combines elaboration and ingenuity of means with ugliness, and often with inferiority of result. These lamps may be excluded from the tale simply because they are bad lamps, and it is possible that one of the lessons to be learned from the story is the realization of this fact. But out comes the big stick. Electric lamps have come to stay, they say. Long ago, Chesterton truly remarked that as soon as he heard anything had come to stay, he knew that it would be very soon replaced, indeed regarded as pitiably obsolete and shabby. The march of science, its tempo quickened by the needs of war, goes inexorably on, making some things obsolete and foreshadowing new developments in the utilization of electricity. An advertisement. This says the same thing, only more menacingly. The electric street lamp may indeed be ignored, simply because it is so insignificant and transient. Fairy stories, at any rate, have many more permanent and fundamental things to talk about. Lightning, for example. The escapist is not so subservient to the whims of evanescent fashion as these opponents. He does not make things, which it may be quite rational to regard as bad, his masters or his gods by worshipping them as inevitable, even inexorable. And his opponents, so easily contemptuous, have no guarantee that he will stop there. He might rouse men to pull down the street lamps. Escapism has another, even wickeder face: reaction. Not long ago, incredible though it may seem, I heard a clerk of Oxenford declare that he welcomed the proximity of mass-production robot factories and the roar of self-obstructive mechanical traffic, because it brought his university into, quote, contact with real life. He may have meant that the way men were living and working in the 20th century was increasing in barbarity at an alarming rate, and that the loud demonstration of this in the streets of Oxford may serve as a warning that it is not possible to preserve for long an oasis of sanity in a desert of unreason by mere fences, without actual offensive action, practical and intellectual. I fear he did not. In any case, the expression real life in this context seems to fall short of academic standards. The notion that motor cars are more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. How real, how startlingly alive, is the factory chimney compared with an elm tree. Poor, obsolete thing, insubstantial dream of an escapist. The, quote, rawness and ugliness of modern European life, that real life, whose contact we should welcome, is, quote, the sign of a biological inferiority or an insufficient or false reaction to environment. The maddest castle that ever came out of a giant's bag in the wild Gaelic stories is not only much less ugly than a robot factory, it is also, to use a very modern phrase, in a very real sense, a great deal more real. Why should we not escape from or condemn the, quote, grim Assyrian absurdity of top hats or the Morlockian horror of factories? They are condemned even by the writers of that most escapist form of all literature, stories of science fiction. These prophets often foretell, and many seem to yearn for, a world like one big glass-roofed railway station. But from them it is, as a rule, very hard to gather what men in such a world town would do. They may abandon the full Victorian panoply for loose garments with zip fasteners, but will use this freedom mainly, it would appear, in order to play with mechanical toys, in the soon cloying game of moving at high speed. To judge by some of these tales, they will still be as lustful, vengeful, and greedy as ever, and the ideals of their idealists hardly reach farther than the splendid notion of building more towns of the same sort on other planets. It is indeed an age of improved means to deteriorated ends. It is part of the essential malady of such days, producing the desire to escape, not indeed from life, but from our present time and self-made misery, that we are acutely conscious both of the ugliness of our works and of their evil. So that to us, evil and ugliness seem indissolubly allied. We find it difficult to conceive of evil and beauty together. The fear of the beautiful fay that ran through the elder ages almost eludes our grasp. Even more alarming, goodness is itself bereft of its proper beauty. In fairy, one can indeed conceive of an ogre who possesses a castle hideous as a nightmare, for the evil of the ogre wills it so. But one cannot conceive of a house built with a good purpose, an inn, a hostel for travelers, the hall of a virtuous and noble king, that is yet sickeningly ugly. At the present day it would be rash to hope to see one that was not, unless it was built before our time. This, however, is the modern and special or accidental escapist aspect of fairy stories, which they share with romances and other stories out of or about the past. Many stories out of the past have only become escapist in their appeal through surviving from a time when men were, as a rule, delighted with the work of their hands into our time, when many men feel disgust with man-made things. But there are also other and more profound escapisms that have always appeared in fairy tale and legend. There are other things more grim and terrible to fly from than the noise, stench, ruthlessness, and extravagance of the internal combustion engine. There are hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, death. And even when men are not facing hard things such as these, there are ancient limitations from which fairy stories offer a sort of escape, and old ambitions and desires, touching the very roots of fantasy, to which they offer a kind of satisfaction and consolation. Some are pardonable weaknesses or curiosities, such as the desire to visit, free as a fish, the deep sea, or the longing for the noiseless, gracious, economical flight of a bird, that longing which the aeroplane cheats, except in rare moments, seen high and by wind and distance noiseless, turning in the sun, that is, precisely when imagined and not used. There are profounder wishes, such as the desire to converse with other living things. On this desire, as ancient as the fall, is largely founded the talking of beasts and creatures in fairy tales, and especially the magical understanding of their proper speech. This is the root, and not the confusion, attributed to the minds of men of the unrecorded past, an alleged absence of the sense of separation of ourselves from beasts. A vivid sense of that separation is very ancient, but also a sense that it was a severance, a strange fate, and a guilt that lies on us. Other creatures are like other realms with which man has broken off relations, and sees now only from the outside at a distance, being at war with them, or on the terms of an uneasy armistice. There are a few men who are privileged to travel abroad a little. Others must be content with the traveler's tales. Even about frogs. In speaking of that rather odd but widespread fairy story, The Frog King, Max Muller asked in his prim way, How came such a story ever to be invented? Human beings were, we may hope, at all times sufficiently enlightened to know that a marriage between a frog and the daughter of a queen was absurd. Indeed, we may hope so. For if not, there would be no point in this story at all, depending as it does essentially on the sense of the absurdity. Folklore origins, or guesses about them, are here quite beside the point. It is of little avail to consider totemism. For certainly, whatever customs or beliefs about frogs and wells lie beyond this story, the frog shape was and is perceived in the fairy story precisely because it was so queer, and the marriage absurd, indeed abominable. Though, of course, in the versions which concern us, Gaelic, German, English, there is in fact no wedding between a princess and a frog. The frog was an enchanted prince. And the point of the story lies not in thinking frogs possible mates, but in the necessity of keeping promises, and even those with intolerable consequences, that, together with observing prohibitions, runs through all fairyland. This is one of the notes of the horns of Elfland, and not a dim note. And lastly, there is the oldest and deepest desire, the great escape, the escape from death. Fairy stories provide many examples and modes of this, which might be called the genuine escapist, or, I would say, fugitive spirit. But so do other stories, notably those of scientific inspiration, and so do other studies. Fairy stories are made by men, not fairies. The human stories of the elves are doubtless full of the escape from deathlessness. But our stories cannot be expected always to rise above our common level. They often do. Few lessons are taught more clearly in them than the burden of that kind of immortality, or rather endless serial living, to which the fugitive would fly. For the fairy story is especially apt to teach these things, of old and still today. But the consolation of fairy stories has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost, I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least, I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, but the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale, and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale, this joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale, or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and in so far as Evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. It is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and having a peculiar quality. Even modern fairy stories can produce this effect sometimes. It is not an easy thing to do. It depends on the whole story, which is the setting of the turn, and yet it reflects a glory backwards. A tale that in any measure succeeds in this point has not wholly failed, whatever flaws it may possess, and whatever mixture or confusion of purpose. It happens even in Andrew Lang's own fairy story, Prince Prigio, unsatisfactory in many ways as that is. When each knight came alive and lifted his sword and shouted, "Long live Prince Prigio," the joy has a little of that strange mythical fairy story quality, greater than the event described. It would have none in Lang's tale if the event described were not a piece of more serious fairy story fantasy than the main bulk of the story, which is in general more frivolous, having the half-mocking smile of the courtly, sophisticated Conte. Far more powerful and poignant is the effect in a serious tale of fairy. In such stories, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire, that for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through. 7 long years I served for thee, the glassy hill I claim for thee, the bluidy shirt I rang for thee, and wilt thou not waken and turn to me? He heard and turned to her. Epilogue. This joy which I have selected as the mark of the true fairy story or romance, or as the seal upon it, merits more consideration. Probably every writer making a secondary world, a fantasy, every sub-creator, wishes in some measure to be a real maker, or hopes that he is drawing on reality, hopes that the peculiar quality of this secondary world, if not all the details, are derived from reality, or are flowing into it. If he indeed achieves a quality that can be fairly described by the dictionary definition, inner consistency of reality, it is difficult to conceive how this can be, if the work does not in some way partake of reality. The peculiar quality of the joy in successful fantasy can thus be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It is not only a consolation for the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction and an answer to that question, is it true? The answer to this question that I gave at first was, quite rightly, if you have built your little world well, yes, it is true in that world. That is enough for the artist, or the artist's part of the artist. But in that eucatastrophe, we see in a brief glimpse that the answer may be greater. It may be a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium in the real world. The use of this word gives a hint of my epilogue. It is a serious and dangerous matter. It is presumptuous of me to touch upon such a theme, but if by grace what I say has in any respect any validity, it is, of course, only one facet of a truth incalculably rich, finite only because the capacity of man, for whom this was done, is finite. I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt-making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect as to others of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect, self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that man would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it either leads to sadness or wrath. It is not difficult to imagine the peculiar excitement and joy that one would feel if any specially beautiful fairy story were found to be primarily true, its narrative to be history, without thereby necessarily losing the mythical or allegorical significance that it had possessed. It is not difficult, for one is not called upon to try and conceive anything of a quality unknown. The joy would have exactly the same quality, if not the same degree, as the joy which the turn in a fairy story gives. Such joy has the very taste of primary truth. Otherwise, its name would not be joy. It looks forward or backward, The direction in this regard is unimportant to the great eucatastrophe. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but it is preeminently, infinitely, if our capacity were not finite, high and joyous. But this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. But in God's kingdom, the presence of the greatest does not depress the small. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy, still go on, and should go on. The Evangelium has not abrogated legends. It has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The Christian has still to work, with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die. But he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose, which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated that he may now, perhaps, fairly dare to guess that in fantasy he may actually assist in the affoliation and multiple enrichment of creation. All tales may come true, and yet, at the last, redeemed they may be as like and unlike the forms that we give them as man. Finally redeemed, we will be like and unlike the fallen that we know. This concludes Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. Thank you for watching.